Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is November 24th. On this day in 1971, a man named Dan Cooper boarded a short commercial flight from Portland to Seattle. Midway through the flight, he passed a note to a flight attendant claiming that he had a bomb. What followed was a calm but calculated skyjacking that ended with Cooper parachuting out of a Boeing 727 over the Pacific Northwest with $200,000 in ransom money strapped to his body and vanishing into history. And thanks to a reporting error, the name that stuck wasn't Dan Cooper, it was D.B. Cooper. Today, we're talking about one of the most famous unsolved cases in American history, the disappearance of D.B. Cooper, a case that has sparked books, documentaries, and decades of theories. Let's get started. November 24th, 1971 was the afternoon before Thanksgiving. On that day, a man wearing a business suit and carrying a briefcase paid cash for a one-way ticket on Northwest Orient Flight 305 to Seattle. He took his seat, ordered a bourbon and soda, and quietly handed a note to the flight attendant. At first, she didn't read it, but he leaned in and reportedly told her, quote, "Miss, you better look at that note. I have a bomb," end quote. Inside his briefcase, she later said, were red cylinders and wires. His demand was simple and specific: $200,000 in $20 bills and 4 parachutes to be handed over when they landed in Seattle. While Flight 305 circled overhead, officials on the ground scrambled. The airlines and authorities worked quickly to gather the ransom and parachutes. By the time the jet landed, the money, 10,000 unmarked $20 bills with their serial numbers carefully recorded, was ready. Cooper let the 36 passengers off the plane in exchange for the cash and the gear, but he kept several crew members on board. The preserved serial numbers on those bills would become important years later. Once his demands were met, Cooper gave new instructions: fly to Mexico City, but under specific conditions. The plane had to stay under 10,000 feet, and its speed couldn't exceed 200 knots, just slow enough to safely open the plane's rear stairs in flight. The 727 took off again that evening, planning a fuel stop in Reno. But somewhere over southern Washington, just after 8 p.m., the rear air stairs were deployed. The cabin pressure changed. By the time the plane touched down in Reno, Cooper and the money were gone. On board, investigators found a few clues: a black clip-on tie with a mother-of-pearl tie clasp, 2 unused parachutes, and partial fingerprints. But not a trace of the man who had hijacked the flight. The FBI launched an extensive investigation they called NORJAC, short for Northwest Hijacking. They interviewed hundreds of people, checked leads across the country, and searched the heavily forested terrain south of Mount St. Helens where Cooper may have landed. Within 5 years, the Bureau had looked into more than 800 suspects. But nothing stuck. One thing they did clear up: the name D.B. Cooper was actually a media mix-up. The man on the boarding pass was Dan Cooper. Despite the massive search effort and piles of tips, investigators were left with just a handful of clues. And privately, many doubted that he had survived. The jump had been made at night, in stormy weather with a non-steerable parachute, and Cooper wasn't dressed for the elements. However, no trace of Cooper, alive or dead, was found. Then, nearly a decade later, on February 10, 1980, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was digging in the sand at Tina Bar along the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington. What he uncovered stunned the country: 3 bundles of decaying $20 bills buried in the sand. The serial numbers matched the ransom money given to D.B. Cooper and totaled about $5,800. The find reignited the mystery, but it didn't answer the big question. Did Cooper live or die after that jump? To this day, no other ransom money has been found in circulation. Over the years, a number of suspects have made headlines. One of the most talked about is Richard Floyd McCoy, who hijacked a plane in a similar way just months later. But the FBI ruled him out. He didn't match witness descriptions, and the Bureau has cited other reasons as well. Forensics also added new layers to the mystery. On the tie that Cooper left behind, investigators found particles of titanium and other rare industrial materials. That led to speculation that he may have worked in aerospace or manufacturing. News outlets like the Washington Post and King 5 in Seattle have reported on these findings, but none of the forensic leads have brought investigators any closer to a name. In 2016, 45 years after the skyjacking, the FBI officially closed the case, stating that they needed to focus their resources elsewhere. But that didn't stop amateur sleuths, journalists, and authors from continuing the search. The Cooper hijacking happened during a wave of skyjackings in the early 1970s. It was cases like this that pushed the U.S. to modernize airport security. Shortly after the incident, airports began using systematic passenger screenings, including metal detectors and X-ray machines. Boeing also made changes to the 727's design, adding a mechanical latch to prevent the rear stairs from being opened mid-flight. That feature became known as the Cooper vane. And yet, the D.B. Cooper story persists. Because it's still fascinating, and with all of the passengers and the crew having been released safely, there isn't the element of human tragedy that a lot of these stories have. Instead, what we have is a man in a suit with a briefcase who knew just enough about aircraft to make his audacious plan work. We have a ransom that partly resurfaced years later, and a vanishing act that no one has ever been able to explain. Did he die in the woods that night, or walk away into obscurity, never telling a soul who he really was? We may never know, but what's certain is that this one act, a handwritten note, 4 parachutes, and a calculated escape, pushed American aviation into a new era and created the most iconic unsolved case of air piracy the U.S. has ever seen. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this episode compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!